"Whoever makes my daughter laugh will marry me," said the chief, and the herdsman shocked everyone. Welcome to Odi Ray Stories, from ancient African myths to modern mysteries. So sit back, relax, let's journey together through the magic of storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe. The marketplace of Adup village was silent the day Chief Afolabi made his declaration. The silence was not the normal morning quiet of market women waiting for customers. It felt like the gods themselves were hovering overhead, holding their breath. Even the wind hesitated. Even flies slowed in the air. Chief Afolabi stood at the center of the courtyard, wearing the coral beads of his ancestors, the heavy red cloth of power, and the grief of a father whose house had lost its music. His palms were raised to the sky. "Whoever makes my daughter, Adana, laugh again, will marry her and inherit half my wealth." He shouted it again and again, like a man carving the sentence into fate. The villagers gasped. Some covered their mouths. Some whispered. Some stepped backwards. They were afraid not because the chief was angry. They were afraid because grief had made him fearless. 2 years. 2 seasons of harmattan. 2 seasons of planting and harvest. 2 seasons of festivals that felt like funerals. In those 2 years the princess did not smile. She did not giggle. She did not grin. She did not even exhale in amusement. Laughter became a creature she once knew but could no longer see. The day she lost her twin brother, the river swallowed more than his body. It swallowed the color in her eyes. It swallowed the music in her chest. It swallowed the memory of joy. Chief Afolabi called healers from Igola, diviners from Ife, comedians from Lagos who made governors choke on palm wine from laughter. None succeeded. One man tried to force a joke so aggressively the chief banished him. One woman tried a laughter ritual using goat blood and palm oil. Guards threw her out before she drew the first sigil. Her face remained stone. Her heart remained locked in a place no map in this world could point to. Rumors spread across neighboring villages. Rumors traveled like smoke. Rumors traveled like ants. They said the chief's daughter's heart was cursed. They said her brother had not drowned by accident. They said the river spirit took one twin and sealed the other. They said ancestors were angry. They said the coming generation would never laugh again until the curse was broken. Some believed. Some shrugged. Some feared going near the waters after sunset. Some tied cowries to their doors. Some told their children to not whistle at night. Through all this, Princess Adana sat in her chamber like a statue carved from absence. She barely slept. She barely ate. The palace servants moved around her like one moves around a shrine. No one joked in her presence. No one told stories. Chief Afolabi tried to distract himself with governance. He tried to bury himself in petitions from farmers. But grief is a parasite that eats in silence. The absence of her laughter changed the acoustics of the palace. It made sound heavier. It made time slower. The queen had died when the twins were 5. The princess once laughed like sunlight. She laughed like someone who had never feared the world. Her laughter used to ring across the courtyard like bells during festival season. Now the palace felt like a shrine of ghosts. One evening, after the last failed healer left and the chief sat alone staring into a lantern flame, he thought, if the gods took so much from me, then let the world try. Let destiny decide whether someone exists who remembers laughter the way she once did. That was the day he chose the challenge. And so he announced it again. "Whoever makes my daughter laugh again will marry her and inherit half my wealth." Some men secretly practiced jokes in their sleep. Some dancers prepared routines. One poet promised verses so beautiful laughter would burst accidentally. Many talked. Many planned. Yet none stepped forward that first day. Because how do you provoke laughter from someone whose heart has been sealed inside grief so deep the world itself cannot hear her breathe? The villagers whispered that night. The chief is desperate. The challenge is impossible. The curse is real. If she cannot laugh, then no one will inherit anything. This is a wager against fate. And in her chamber, Adana stared at the horizon like the horizon was the only thing still capable of holding her grief without breaking. Until one dusty morning, a young herdsman walked into the village square. His name was Tund. His clothes were torn. His sandals were made from old car tires. He walked with a strange, gentle steadiness, like someone who had lived close enough to pain to recognize it instantly in another. People laughed at him before he even spoke. You make her laugh. You cannot even make your own cows smile. But Tund smiled, a quiet small smile that looked like it had survived storms. A smile that did not mock pain. A smile built from patience. Maybe laughter is like a lost cow, he replied softly. You do not find it by shouting. You find it by listening. And for the first time in 2 years, hope flickered not in the palace, but in the crowd. Even the elders who pretended not to believe in miracles felt their chests tighten. Because sometimes destiny enters quietly, wearing rags, arriving from the bush paths no one watches. That night, Tund did not arrive like someone chasing a reward. He did not arrive like someone confident in victory. He arrived like someone who knew that suffering recognizes suffering long before comedy ever matters. He arrived with dust in his hair, sun baked into his skin, and the calm of someone who had learned to live slowly while the world rushed like impatient water. Word of his bold statement spread across a dupe before the sun reached the highest point. Children ran between stalls shouting the news. Hunters paused sharpening their blades. Old women selling pepper pretended not to care but leaned closer to hear every detail. Some laughed, but under the laughter there was a second emotion they refused to name. Desperation. Because deep down, every single person in a dupe wanted to see the princess laugh again. Not just because she was beloved, but because her sadness had become the emotional climate of the entire land. The laughter drought infected everyone, even the young. The world was heavier because she was heavy. When Tund was led into the palace compound, the guards did not hide their smirks. One guard whispered loudly enough for half the courtyard to hear, "If this is who fate sends, then the gods have given up on us." Tund bowed his head slightly, but he did not respond. Not in words. Instead he studied each guard slowly, like he was memorizing their faces. Not to fight them later, but because every face reveals something about the world a person lives inside. The guard who mocked him had bitterness behind his eyes. Another guard had exhaustion hiding behind forced toughness. The third guard had fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when someone secretly believes the river can take more if provoked wrong. When they escorted Tund toward the princess's chamber, even the birds seemed to go silent as he passed. Princess Adana sat on her carved wooden stool, looking at the horizon from the open side window. The sky was pale, washed out, colorless like she was. She did not turn when Tund entered. She did not look. It was as if she lived behind an invisible doorway only she could see. The chamber was filled with flowers that had been placed there daily since her loss. But the scent was heavy, oppressive, suffocating. Beauty can suffocate when it can no longer be received. Tund bowed low. Not with the submission of a beggar. Not with the flamboyance of a performer. But with the reverence of someone acknowledging land that held the bones of pain. He waited. He did not speak. He did not attempt to amuse. He did not attempt to force reaction. Princess Adana did not respond. She did not turn. She did not blink. The chief watched from behind the curtain again. He did not want to hope, but hope has its own stubborn appetite. It forces itself through cracks even after a man locks the door. The court expected Tund to fail quickly. They expected him to start dancing or performing tricks. They expected him to act desperate. But Tund did the opposite of everything anyone had done in 2 years. He listened. He listened not to her silence as emptiness, but as presence. Silence is not absence. Silence is information. Silence is memory. Silence is language. Only people too afraid to face their own broken parts are terrified of silence. Tund understood this instinctively. He knew silence is where trauma tucks itself away to remain protected from careless people. After a long stillness, he spoke with a voice that sounded like wind moving slowly across dry grass. Before I try to make you laugh, I must first know what your silence sounds like. The court reacted like he had spoken blasphemy. The chief's jaw tightened. Some women gasped. The palace scribe's quill paused mid-air, because no one had ever addressed her grief as if it deserved to speak back. Princess Adana did not respond, but her breath hitched. Subtle. Small. Her body heard him even if her mind refused to trust yet. Tund left the palace after that single sentence. He walked out through the market path and sat under the iroko tree at the edge of the palace wall. He pulled out a small hand-carved flute, carved from the branch of a tree that survived lightning strike. Its sound was not cheerful. It was soft, slow, hesitant. The sound was like someone gently dusting an old memory rather than trying to replace it. The tune did not demand anything. It simply existed. People gathered slowly. Even some guards lingered, though pretending not to. No one spoke. This went on for hours. When night fell, the guards mocked him again. Is that all you have? You sit here and do nothing. Tund smiled slightly. You cannot awaken laughter without understanding the wound that buried it. The guard almost responded angrily, but something about the sentence stopped him. Because he too had a pain he could not speak publicly. Many people in Adup did. Everyone had lost someone. Not everyone healed. The next morning when Tund arrived again, the chief allowed it. Without ritual. Because even though no one admitted it aloud yet, something had shifted. Tund sat outside her chamber window again. He did not speak. He watched the curtains move. He listened to how the wind spoke against the wood frame. He studied dust on sunlight. He observed breath. People mocked him again. But the mockery now sounded thinner. Because when desperation stays too long, the mind begins to gamble with unlikely hope. On the third morning, Princess Adana finally spoke. Why do you keep playing that sad tune? Tund smiled gently, still careful not to violate the fragile trust forming like mist over early soil. Because it sounds like you. Beautiful, but trapped. Silence. And something inside her shifted. Pain finally heard someone speak its language without fear. And that was the beginning. When the chief heard that Adana had spoken a sentence, even a single, small, simple sentence, he did not sleep that night. He paced the palace halls like a man guarding a fragile flame he feared could vanish if he blinked. The moon was high when he finally sat down, and he stared at his own hands as if he was trying to remember what hope felt like. He had forgotten the shape of it. He had forgotten its temperature. Hope had lived so far from him that its return felt suspicious. Yet that one moment changed the air in Adup village. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. And quiet is where the most dangerous miracles begin. Tund returned the next morning with the same calm presence. The guards watched him like observers watching an animal whose instincts they did not understand. The palace maids whispered about him in corners, but not cruelly this time. They whispered like people noticing a crack in a prison wall that had been solid for far too long. Something invisible was shifting. And the invisible is always where destiny works first. Adana did not greet Tund. She did not look toward him. But she did not reject his presence. That alone was ground the entire kingdom had failed to conquer. The court expected foolish performance. He offered stillness. And stillness is what trauma responds to when it does not trust anything else. He sat cross-legged on the palace floor just outside her window and listened again, as if her silence was speaking more than any words could. He waited like someone who respected the pace of pain. Some hearts cannot be rushed. For 3 days, the court watched Tund do almost nothing except breathe near the princess. But in reality he was doing everything. On the first day, he listened to the sound of her silence in the morning light. That silence was stiff and brittle. Like dry bone. Like sorrow that had become structural. The second day he listened under afternoon sun. The silence there was different. It buried secrets. It avoided old memories like someone avoids a river after too many drownings. On the third day he listened beneath starlight. That silence was hollow and thin. Like a drum stretched too tightly. Like if someone touched it gently enough, it might finally spill something trapped inside. Every night he returned under the iroko tree and played the same three-note tune. The village children would gather silently around him. They did not laugh. They did not whisper. They simply sat and listened, the same way he listened to Adana. And villagers, even those who mocked him before, noticed something strange. The tune that once sounded sad began to sound like companionship. Not joy yet, but companionship. The kind that does not abandon someone simply because their heart is too heavy to respond yet. On the fourth morning, the chief spoke to Tund. He had not addressed him directly since the proclamation. He studied Tund for a long moment before speaking. "Do you believe you can succeed?" Tund did not rush to answer. He looked toward the princess's window and said softly, "I believe that laughter is not noise. Laughter is the final stage of healing. We have not reached the end. We are still at the beginning." The chief did not know if this was foolishness or wisdom. But his chest tightened. Because no healer had ever spoken about the princess as if she was still recoverable. Later that afternoon, Adana spoke again. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak dramatically. She spoke like someone who had been silently thinking for 3 days and finally allowed the thought to step into sunlight. She said, "That tune you play at night sounds like morning. Why do you choose it?" Tund turned toward her, his face gentle, his voice quiet like wind before rain. "Because grief must feel seen before it surrenders." Her breath trembled. Not because the words hurt her, but because the words recognized her. No one had ever tried to understand her wound before trying to fix it. No one had ever given her sorrow permission to speak. Tund bowed his head slightly. "I cannot make you laugh if I do not first make your grief feel safe." That sentence entered her like medicine no healer had ever possessed. For the first time, Adana turned away from the horizon. Enough to acknowledge the existence of the world again. Enough to acknowledge that the boundary between her pain and life outside her pain was beginning to thin. The guards watching her froze. And that night, while Tund played under the iroko tree again, many villagers came not to mock but to witness. Some cried quietly. Hope is terrifying after living inside mourning for too long. The chief watched from the palace balcony, his hands shaking. Healing is slow and quiet. Every day Tund sat with her silence. The seed of laughter was being watered. The world did not see the bloom yet, but the roots were forming. And a root is proof that a future exists. By dawn, she did not look like stone anymore. Something inside her began to move again. Breath. Breath is the first sound that returns before joy does. The morning after the fourth night, the air in Adup village felt different. Like something was loosening. Like something ancient finally exhaled after holding breath for far too long. Sometimes, the world changes first in the places no one sees. Sometimes the body remembers safety before the mind does. Tund arrived again that morning with his flute. The guards did not mock him this time. They watched him with a fear that looked like longing. Humans secretly fear what they need most. They fear the people who can touch the parts hidden too deep for language. Adana sat at her window again. But this time, when Tund bowed, she blinked twice, intentionally, not out of reflex. It meant the barrier was cracking. Tund sat again where he always sat, cross-legged on the ground near her window. He placed the flute on his lap. And then he told a story. He spoke softly, as if speaking too loudly could scare away something delicate. His voice was not theatrical. It was not exaggerated. It was not designed to shock or impress. It was a voice shaped for healing. And he began by saying, "Princess, today I will tell you a story I learned from the river itself." She stared, still expressionless, but she was listening. Listening with the kind of quiet that carries weight. The court leaned forward. Tun told the story of a cow near the river with a twin calf. They played together. They ran together. They slept curled beside each other like two halves of one soul. But one day the river rose suddenly. The river swallowed one twin while the other watched helplessly. The cow screamed until its voice broke. For weeks the cow could not eat, could not drink, could not move. Then one night, the cow dreamed it saw its twin on the other side laughing. When the cow finally crossed the river, expecting to drown in grief, it did not die. On the other side, in the land beyond breath, the twin waited. And the twin laughed with joy not because death was victory, but because love did not end. The twin said to the surviving twin, "You must laugh again on the living side. I will laugh on this side. And when the world ends and the rivers close, our laughter will collide and become one again." Adana's breath shook. She turned fully toward him now. Her eyes shimmered wet like someone trying not to drown inside memory. She whispered with a voice that had not been used correctly in 2 years. You knew about my brother?" Tund bowed his head. "The river told me. Every stream carries memory. Every river remembers the names of the ones it has taken. Rivers do not forget the twins they separate." The palace servants froze. This was too sacred. Even the wind refused to move. Because grief had never been recognized with this level of reverence before. Adana closed her eyes and tears fell silently. Not violent tears. Tears that release. Tears that wash. Tears that unearth the room where laughter once lived. Tun did not touch her. Tun did not console her. He let her cry in her silence, because he knew the body must finish old grief before it can create new sound. The chief watched behind the curtain, but this time his hands were not on his chest in fear. They were on his head in astonishment. He was watching a miracle that did not come from incantation, or ritual threat, or traveled priests. A miracle born from stillness, patience, presence, and story. When Adana opened her eyes again, she asked quietly, "Will I ever laugh again?" Tund answered gently, "Laughter is not a trick. Laughter is a memory waking up. And your memory will wake." That night, villagers spoke of nothing else. The rumor traveled faster than palm wine cellars could measure temperature. People whispered that the curse was cracking. Old women who once dismissed him now warned children not to mock destiny again. The hunters who had mocked him sat by the fire silently. Meanwhile, Tun sat under the iroko tree again, but this time his flute sounded different. The 3-note tune still carried grief, but it now carried direction, movement, waking. The children tilted their heads, confused by the subtle shift. They were hearing the sound of a wound turning into wisdom. They were hearing healing in process. The court watched Tund with new eyes. Afraid. Because they knew if Tund succeeded, the entire foundation of power would shift. The one who brings laughter back is not just husband. He becomes symbol. Adana lay in her chamber that night with her tears dried on her cheeks, and she did not feel empty. She felt something for the first time in 2 years. Anticipation. Not excitement, but anticipation that feeling itself might be possible again. She stared at the moon and whispered, "Brother, can you hear me now?" She heard the river again. But this time, the river did not sound like a thief of joy. It sounded like a patient messenger. And the wind that night carried the soft sound of something new taking shape, the beginning of a heart preparing to remember what laughter feels like. The Festival of Lights arrived in a Dup village. Torches were prepared. Palm oil lanterns were hung across the courtyard. Drummers rehearsed rhythms older than colonial memory. Hunters sharpened their blades because festival tradition demanded tools shine. Even children sensed this night was different. Chief Afalabi stood at the center of the courtyard again, wearing the same coral beads of his ancestors, but tonight his beads did not look heavy. Tonight they carried expectation instead of grief. Everyone felt suspense as wait. Every person waited to see if the herdsman's patience had not been foolishness, but prophecy. Tund arrived quietly as always. his sandals of old tires, his clothes worn, his hands still holding the same flute carved from lightning wood. But tonight, when he walked through the village square toward the courtyard, no one mocked him. People stepped aside for him the way they step aside for sacred masquerade. People held their breath when he passed. Tonight was a test of destiny itself. Adana entered the courtyard accompanied by 2 royal attendants. The silence that followed her entrance was heavy. She wore white. Pure white. White that looked like mourning, but also rebirth. Her face remained composed. She did not smile. But she did not look like stone. She looked like someone who now remembered that she once had a voice that belonged to the living world. Her steps were slow, but they were not dragging. She sat on a carved stool positioned to face the courtyard, not the horizon. Tund stepped into the center before her. The chief did not speak. The elders did not speak. The palace scribes did not write. All waited for the moment to unfold itself. Then Tund began the performance. He did not start with the flute. He began instead with the children of the village. He secretly taught them a playful routine earlier that day. The children wore small pieces of fabric tied around their waists, each piece dyed in bright color. Tund placed them in a line, each child holding the rope attached to the goats he had borrowed from farmers. The goats wore mismatched pieces of colored cloth too. It looked ridiculous. Tund clapped one slow rhythm. The children began moving in clumsy procession with the goats. The goats tried to dance but their legs tangled. A goat walked sideways and bumped another goat. The children tried to keep balance but stumbled. One child dropped the rope entirely and a goat began running in confused circles. Tund tried to stop the runaway goat and ended up slipping in mud and falling backward into a tray of roasted yam someone placed near the musicians. The courtyard exploded in laughter. Even the chief laughed like thunder shaking the ground. Elders laughed like wine had taken them. The market women laughed and slapped their thighs. The children fell on each other laughing at themselves. The goats made confused animal noises that somehow made everything funnier. And then, something impossible happened. Adana laughed. Not a small laugh. She laughed from deep inside the place where laughter had been buried for 2 years. She laughed until tears fell from her eyes. She laughed until the pain inside her chest began to crumble. She laughed like the sound itself was breaking chains the river had placed around her heart. She laughed like laughter was a forgotten language returning fluently. Tund did not move. He just looked at her like someone watching sunrise. The chief watched. The entire kingdom watched a miracle that healed more than one girl. It healed everyone who had lived inside her grief. Because when one person stops laughing, the entire village loses something. But when laughter returns, the entire world shifts. Adana looked at Tund and gasped for breath between laughter. She could barely speak, but she whispered, "You did it." Tund shook his head slowly. "No. You did. You remembered." The chief rose, lifted both hands to the sky, and declared with a voice that shook the land, "The gods have witnessed. The ancestors have witnessed. Tund, son of no noble line, you have returned life to my child. You have earned her heart and her future. You will marry my daughter and inherit half my wealth as promised." The villagers roared in celebration. But the most powerful moment was not the declaration. The most powerful moment was the look Princess Adana gave Tund. It was not gratitude alone. It was recognition. A recognition that the wound she thought had drowned forever now carried possibility. The festival continued all night. Drummers played like summoning victory. The children tilted their heads, confused by the subtle shift they could not name earlier, now laughing without hesitation. Children chased goats. The village glowed like memory itself was burning bright. Tund sat again under the iroko tree. But this time he did not play the sad 3-note tune. He played new melody. A melody that sounded like dawn sunlight reflecting on calm water. The children gathered again, but this time they did laugh. And Adana stood at her window, smiling softly, listening. And everyone who heard the flute that night knew the entire future of Adup village had changed forever. Forever changed world. The feast lasted days. Adup village danced until their feet ached, until drums felt like thunder stitched into the bones of every person alive. The goats from the comedy performance became village celebrities. Palm wine sellers never ran out. Everywhere, in every courtyard, in every pathway, the sound of laughter now existed like rain returned after drought. The chief walked like a man whose lungs could finally expand again. He embraced elders he once avoided. He let children jump around him. When he looked at Adana, he saw the daughter he remembered, not the statue grief had carved. Every night, he thanked his ancestors, not with desperation, but with reverence. Tund and Adana became the center of the future. The chief prepared gifts of land and livestock. The elders who mocked him now pretended they always believed. Fate rarely arrives with an announcement. It arrives slow. It arrives quiet. It arrives in the form few expect. On the night before the formal marriage rites, after the third feast had ended, Adana walked to the sacred grove behind the palace where the river could be heard faintly from afar. The moon was full and the air smelled like wet earth. She stood beneath the Iroko tree. Tund was already there, sitting quietly, staring at moonlight on the earth. Adana sat beside him quietly. Not like a princess sitting beside a subject. Not like someone receiving a favor. But like someone choosing partnership from equal spirit. She did not rush to speak. He did not rush to speak. This silence now was soft. Gentle. A silence that allowed breath. A silence that could hold two beating hearts without crushing either one. After a long quiet, Adana turned. She asked softly, "How did you know how to reach me?" Not the strategy. Not the technique. The true origin. Tund's voice when he finally spoke was not strong. It was fragile. Because truth held within pain comes out fragile first. He lost his twin. The same river took him. They were young. They were inseparable. They slept beside each other. They raced through the tall grass like the world was endless and could never break them. But one day, the river pulled one away and left the other alive, with grief sharp enough to tear through bone and breath and future. Tund looked at the ground. 4 months, I refused to speak. I refused to laugh. I refused to live. People told me to forget. People told me to move on. People told me it was fate and I should accept. But rituals cannot stitch closed a wound that still bleeds memory every morning when the eyes open. So I sat alone with the wind. I let the birds teach me how to breathe again. And the river became the only voice I trusted. When I finally listened long enough, the river told me something. Sorrow does not punish. Sorrow teaches. Sorrow reminds. Sorrow is the shadow preserving the shape of love. He handed her the flute. Adana pressed the flute to her forehead. Tund whispered, I played for my brother every night. Not so the world could forget him. But so the world would remember he existed. He played 3 notes because those were the only ones he could hold without crying. And then slowly, he cried through them until they became something else. Until the notes began sounding like memory unburied, not memory drowned. Adana placed her hand on his. Just that gesture carried 2 years of storms dissolving. She whispered, trembling, then maybe both our brothers are laughing together now? Tund smiled gently. A real smile. One that contained pain and healing and completion inside the same shape. He nodded slowly. Yes. Somewhere beyond the river. They sat together beneath the moon for a long time, saying nothing. Because nothing more needed to be said. Their grief recognized each other. Their grief welcomed each other. Their grief no longer existed alone. The river wind carried a faint sound. A faint echo of laughter. Soft. Gentle. Almost like 2 young boys laughing at a joke the world never understood. And from that night forward, whenever the flute of Tund echoed through Adup village, the entire land remembered that sorrow is not a permanent house. Sorrow is a season. Seasons move. Laughter does not erase pain. Laughter reconciles pain with memory. That is the story Adup village told for generations. Not just about the princess. Not just about the herdsman. But about the night two broken halves found wholeness. And how those who returned laughter to the land returned it not with foolishness or tricks, but with patience and silence and story and listening and wounds that learned to breathe again. The night before the wedding, two souls healed enough to become one. The world remembered. Destiny sealed. The end. Loved the story? Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and become part of the Audie Ray Stories family. Your support helps us bring more powerful African tales to life. Thanks for watching. We can't wait to share the next one with you. See you soon.